Welcome to Victor's Children, a podcast from so-called Canada talking socialism from below. My name is David Campfield. I live with my partner and cat in Winnipeg, Manitoba, which is in Treaty 1 territory, the traditional territory of Anishinaabeg, Cree, Ojibwe, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. All those of us in the Canadian state who aren't Indigenous need to commit ourselves to the struggle against settler colonialism. Victor's Children is a member of the Harbinger Media Network, which is a community working to support and promote left podcasts in Canada. Check out other shows like Tech Won't Save Us, Anti-Girl Boss Socialist Club, and Alberta Advantage. You can look at the shows list at harbingermedianetwork.com. Before this episode begins, I have an announcement for listeners in the United States. Both of the guests on this episode, along with Ilya Matveev and Dennis Bondar, are going to be speaking at events in Chicago, New York, and San Francisco and the Bay Area in September 2023, with events sponsored by the Ukraine Solidarity Network. So if you're interested, please see the link about these events in the show notes. It's August the 8th, 2023, nearly a year and a half since the start of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I agree with Gilbert Ashkar, who's, for people who don't know, a socialist of Lebanese origin based in Britain, when he says that the war remains an anti-imperialist war of self-defense on Ukraine's side, even if it is indeed exploited by NATO powers for their own strategic interest, which of course means we should try to oppose anything that might tilt the balance towards turning the war into an essentially inter-imperialist one, in his words. Sadly, though, most people on the left don't understand the war this way, and I think this makes it even more important to develop an adequate internationalist socialist understanding of the war, which means we need dialogue between like-minded people from Ukraine and Russia and those of us outside those states. So I'm very glad to be joined on this episode of Victor's Children by two guests. So could you introduce yourselves? Maybe Hanna first?
Okay, thank you for inviting me. My name is Hanna Perekhoda. I'm a researcher at the University of Lausanne in Switzerland. I'm working on political imagination in Russia and Ukraine with a particular focus on the events of 1917. I'm also a member of a Swiss-based committee of solidarity with Ukraine and with the Russian anti-war activists, and also a member of a Ukrainian democratic left organization called Socialny Ruch.
I think is social movement in English, right?
Yeah.
Ilya?
Thank you for having me. My name is Ilya Matveev. I'm a political scientist, currently a visiting scholar at UC Berkeley in the United States. I study Russian political economy, and currently my focus is Russian imperialism and its political economic origins.
Great. So to start with, could you give your opinion about why you think Putin launched the invasion and how we should explain what has happened?
So, all right, I can start. This is actually not an easy question because there is no definite answer provided by anyone. And furthermore, it is still difficult to understand. So why this decision was made? It's not, in my opinion, it was not a rational decision. And if one looks at kind of objective economic processes, political processes, there is no real reason to start this war. So in my opinion, this decision was subjective. It was based on a kind of ideology, a nationalist reactionary ideology that Putin personally possesses, and on his complete rejection of this idea that Ukraine can be a sovereign, independent nation. And so this led Putin to start this war. And certainly if he didn't start it, then this war would be avoided. So this is important to understand. It was not predetermined in any way. It was Putin's decision.
Yeah, I agree with Ilya that this question is a difficult one and it deserves a separate lecture, actually. So if we try to simplify, I would say there are two main elements, general elements. Firstly, an ideological and then a real war is, of course, a classic tool for persuading the impoverished population that they must not rebel against the elites that exploit them in a completely uncontrolled manner. So we know that Putin turned Russia into one of the most unequal states in the world. 1% of Russians owns 75% of the total wealth of the country. And of course, the more the inequality grows, the more vulnerable the regime feels, and the more aggressive it becomes externally. But what I would like to discuss more in details, and here I join Ilya, is the reason why this war was actually launched against Ukraine in particular, and not against another country, another post-Soviet country, because Ukraine is a country with which ordinary Russians have the most cultural proximity. Many people have family ties, friends there, and if Ukraine succeeds actually in building a democratic and prosperous state, it risks to awaken some dangerous ideas among Russian population, who may ask itself if Ukrainians, people very similar to us, do not need a repressive authoritarian state to live normally, why do we need it? So this is the first reason, I think, why Ukraine was a target. But the second one is that Ukraine occupies a very, very important place in the mindset of the Russian ruling classes, in their identity, as it was formed in the 19th century, and as it survived up to this day. And I think Putin sincerely shares these kind of nationalist ideas. And just to give a few elements to understand what is this representation of Ukraine, is that for Russian political elites, losing Ukraine in this worldview means first to lose a great power status. That means no longer being equal to this Western significative other, to this Western model. And for example, when these nationalist ideas were born in the 19th century, Ukraine was seen as an essential element for a strong Russian nation, consolidated national core that was perceived as a key to success in this inter-imperialist competition with France, with Germany, with other imperialist states. So Ukraine was kind of a central element to the power of the Russian nation, to the strength of the Russian nation. And the second element, that when the Russian nationalism was born in the 19th century, the elites were trying to preserve their autocratic power in this world that was submerged by the revolution. And Ukraine was seen as kind of the last outpost against this virus of democracy, virus of nationalism, etc. So today, Ukraine is also perceived by Putin, by the political elites, in the same way. If Ukraine escapes from under control, as they imagine, they think that it will Ukraine will inevitably infiltrate Russia with these subversive ideas. This is why to turn Ukrainians into Russians is perceived by the Russian political class as something as a necessary condition for their ontological security, for the ontological security of the Russian state. And just to finish on this, just to say that Putin and his like-minded people started this war following this logic of ontological security and not the logic of this physical security. So it has nothing to do with the real threat of other countries, of NATO, whatsoever, but it has everything to do with the ideological structures that determine the worldview of Russian ruling classes.
So I actually agree with this point. The second point, that Ukraine really occupies a very special place in this political imagination of the Kremlin. It's just true. And this leads Putin and his associates to make these terrible, irrational decisions. But what's important here is also that there is a context to this war. So aggression against Ukraine actually started in 2014. And so, like, my opinion, after studying this for a long time, is that in 2022, Putin wanted to kind of untie this Gordian knot in just one swift move, because he tried this covert kind of slow, gradual process of aggression against Ukraine. And his idea was that if Russia annexes Crimea, if Russia occupies east of Ukraine, then Ukraine will lose its ability to be an independent country. And so ultimately, it will be kind of subservient to Russia, and Russia will have a huge influence in Ukraine. So that was the point. The point was, it was never just about Crimea or just about Donbass. It was about controlling Ukraine and trying to have a kind of veto power over Ukrainian affairs. And then what Putin saw is that this strategy failed, because instead of being controlled by Russia, Ukraine was more and more moving into anti-Russian kind of pro-Western direction. And this is perfectly understandable, because if you face an aggressor, that would be a strange thing, to move closer to this aggressor. So Russia annexes Crimea, and then Ukrainians suddenly should be grateful to Russia for something, right? So it's understandable that Ukraine was moving away from Russia, and so Putin's primary objective was never achieved. And at some point, he decided that, we need to end the situation. So it's going badly for Russia. My previous kind of strategy is not working. I was trying to influence Ukraine through these occupied territories. I was trying to influence Ukraine through pro-Russian politicians like Medvedchuk. But Ukraine is just... So I'm failing with this strategy. Therefore, I just need to solve this problem once and for all. Solve the Ukrainian problem. And so... But the way for him to solve this problem was to try and conquer the whole country. Of course, there was another solution, just to stop this aggression, basically, and retreat and stop the imperialist practice. But for Putin, of course, it was not a solution. So there's an interesting book by an American political scientist, Jack Snyder. It's called Myths of Empire. So the basic point is that once there is an imperialist policy, a policy of kind of violent expansion. So politicians and political class, they are prone to continuing this policy instead of abandoning this policy, even though you see that it's counterproductive. So, for instance, Russia annexed Crimea, Russia attacked Donbass, and then NATO troops in Europe actually increased after this fact, because of this fact, right? So the West became more consolidated in its confrontation with Russia. So the policy is clearly not working. And so maybe this is the time to rethink this policy. But instead of rethinking it, Putin actually doubled down on the same failed policy, and he launched the full-scale invasion that was destined to fail. It was obvious to anyone that this was going to fail. So I remember perfectly, I think like anyone in Russia or in Ukraine, the 24th of February when this happened. And so it was immediately clear to me that this invasion will fail eventually. So details were not clear, but the fact that this is going to fail was clear to me, but not to Putin, because this is how these myths of empire operate. So they somehow cloud your judgment, and you think that if you just keep on attacking, keep on expanding, then your problems will be solved. But the opposite is actually the case, and ultimately the Kremlin will learn this lesson.
It's interesting. We could consider this as just a recent example of many ruling class self-delusions. It reminds me a little bit of the U.S. ruling class thinking about being able to win in Vietnam back in the 60s. But maybe, Ilya, you could put some of this in another context. If we think about global capitalism as being organized in a system which is hierarchical, where the U.S. is still at the top, although it's relatively less powerful than it once was. China is rising. You can think about, to use the phrase of Lenin's, an imperialist chain. Where does Russia fit within that system today?
Right. So this is one of the difficult problems here, because as Marxists, we tend to see the logic of events through some kind of political economic lens. But then there was no real reason, economic reason. I mean, there was no kind of contradiction in the process of capital accumulation that should have led Russia to attack Ukraine, neither in 2014, neither in 2022. So yes, there was an economic conflict. So in 2013, 2014, Putin wanted Ukraine to join his Eurasian Economic Union, so his regional structure, and Ukrainians didn't want that, so they wanted to ultimately join the European Union. And there was a clash of two economic projects and free trade agreements, essentially. But and yes, there was a real conflict of economic interests behind that, because if Ukraine joined Russia's regional project, then it would be very beneficial for Russian capitalists. It's true. But the thing is, to answer Ukraine's unwillingness to join Russia's alliance with this military aggression, this is even more counterproductive, because even in 2014, so when Russia began all these things, so some of Russian investments in Eastern Ukraine, they were lost because of the war itself. You know that actually the Kremlin invested at least $8 billion only in East Ukraine, only through its state bank. It's called Bank. So Putin had this idea of trying to acquire a lot of industrial assets in Eastern Ukraine to try and influence Ukrainian economy and Ukrainian politics in this way. And so there were a lot of Russian investments in East Ukraine. And these investments, they were damaged by the war itself. So all these factories, they just stopped working. And basically it was a loss for the Bank. It was a loss of some $8-10 billion, just that. And other Russian state companies, they also had investments all over Ukraine. And this was also a loss for these companies. So some of these investments, they were sold below their price. Some of them were expropriated by Ukrainian authorities. So this previous economic strategy, economic imperialism, it stopped working because of this military aggression. So, and kind of in a wider view, for Russian capital, it was quite beneficial to be integrated into the global economy. Yes, the global economy was dominated and still is dominated by the West, by the United States, but still it was very advantageous for Russian companies to be integrated into these global financial flows. And they were making profits. They were investing all over the world. So there was economic expansion, but the military expansion that Putin started contradicted this previous economic way of integrating into the global economy, into the global system. So I don't think that this was caused by some structural economic process. It was caused by the Kremlin's decision. And it is possible, for imperialism to have this autonomous political logic. It is not necessarily caused by some kind of structural economic factors. Although, of course, these factors are present. So, for instance, between United States and China, there is a lot of structural kind of tension. So this conflict has objective structural roots and economic roots. But with Russia and the United States, there was no real kind of, these tensions were not strong enough to cause this kind of conflict. So I think it was caused by the Kremlin's decision, and this is really the political logic and the ideological logic that caused this conflict, and not some economic contradiction.
Yeah, I might add just a few words about it very shortly. I think that one of the ways to analyze what is happening is also we need to distance ourselves from these neo-realist kind of explanations, which are very, very widespread on the left, on the right, like in the media in general, and actually to adopt more of a constructivist approach, remembering that in international politics, actors act towards the objects, including other actors, on the basis of the meanings that these objects have for them. So we need to understand these meanings. And this is something, the meanings, the values, the norms of the actors we want to analyze. And this is something that actually escapes observers who think only in terms of physical security, economic gain, who are thinking that actually the states are some kind of actors that share some kind of universal rationality. And this universal this understanding of a universal rationality is actually very Western-centered. So I think we need to move to distance ourselves from this very Western-central neo-realist approach. And this is something we must keep in mind if we want to understand the logic behind the Russian invasion of Ukraine.
Right. So, for instance, I would add this question about NATO. So whenever Western leftists talk about this war, they always talk about NATO. So at this moment, not all of them, but still, a lot of Western leftists, they still point to NATO expansion as a cause of the war. But let's look at it from this kind of new realist point of view. So on the one hand, some scholars, they argue that, yes, Russia was just responding to NATO expansion, so it was threatening Russia, therefore Russia had to act and to prevent further NATO expansion. On the other hand, while NATO was including new countries, the number of NATO troops in Europe was actually decreasing. So before 2014, it was decreasing, and it was a much, much smaller contingent than it was during the Soviet times. And in fact, there were no plans to increase the number of NATO troops in Europe, and especially there were no plans to increase the number of NATO troops on Russian borders, because NATO command understood that this would be provocative. So, and in terms of objective kind of security concerns, it didn't make sense to respond to NATO expansion with military aggression, because this is exactly the thing that would lead to the increase in the number of troops. So military aggression will lead to increasing military presence, American military presence in Europe, to increasing military budgets of European countries, and to the general consolidation of NATO. So if you respond to NATO expansion with military aggression, this is exactly the most counterproductive move possible. If you try to counter it with diplomacy, with negotiation, with pointing to NATO's kind of dubious, reason for existence. So the Soviet Union is not there, but NATO still exists. So this could be productive for Russia. But once you respond to NATO with military aggression, you only lead to the increase in this threat. And this is what was happening since 2014. So in terms of the realist view, one realist scholar would say that this theory can explain what Russia is doing. Another scholar would say that this theory actually contradicts what Russia is doing. Because in order to counter the threat, you need to have an objectively rising threat. But NATO was not a rising threat for Russia, right? So in that sense, yes, these tensions between NATO and Russia, they were inevitable, in my opinion. So since Russia was not included in the NATO alliance, it's clear that some kind of tension was inevitable. But to turn this tension into a European military conflict, this was not some kind of predetermined outcome. And I agree completely with Hanna when she says that we need to analyze what meanings the Kremlin had in its targets. So how did the Kremlin think about its objectives? And there was this set of irrational ideas about Ukraine, about the West, and also a very important idea, the West was instigating all these so-called color revolutions. So the Kremlin is just incapable of believing that people rise up by themselves. It's just the part of this KGB mentality that everything is inspired by some foreign power. And so for Putin, this was, it all came together. So for him, the idea was that all the revolutions and uprisings in the post-Soviet countries, somehow they are inspired by America, and America wants to ultimately replace Putin personally. And so they want to start a color revolution in Russia, and they're also expanding NATO, even though they promised not to. So it's all part of this huge conspiracy. And only with asymmetrical force, you can fight this conspiracy. But this was really just irrational ideological thinking in the end.
Well, before we get to talk about some of the arguments and just, points of view that we encounter on the Western left, I did want to ask a question to say, now that once Putin had done what he had done, the U.S. obviously then figured out this was an opportunity for the U.S. administration. So could you say something briefly about what you think the U.S. administration's objectives are in relation to Russia around the war, and also what the U.S. is aiming to achieve vis-a-vis Ukraine?
So I actually don't think that in America, the establishment treats the war as an opportunity. I disagree with this. So it's true that like American policy towards Russia would be different, right? Like the problem maybe was that, for instance, in 2008, so at the NATO summit, there was this promise that Ukraine and Georgia would join NATO eventually, but no concrete roadmap for them to join NATO. So that was a bad decision because it created uncertainty. So on the one hand, the Kremlin doesn't like this idea, right? And so this kind of enrages the Kremlin. On the other hand, Ukraine and Georgia are still not protected by NATO because there is no even a concrete path for them to join. So it leaves Ukraine in a bad position. So this was probably a bad move. And the point was back in 2000s, back like 15 years ago, to try and create some kind of common, security architecture, something like that. So maybe that was possible 15 years ago. But since then, America was not trying to provoke Russia with Ukraine. This is a fundamentally wrong idea. So, for instance, there was this report published by RAND Corporation. So it's called Extending Russia. It was published in 2019, as I remember. And Russian propaganda uses it as proof that America wanted to provoke Russia by kind of inspiring these events in Ukraine. So this report is really, it's not nice. So the basic point is that America and Russia are in this huge confrontation. Therefore, America needs to extend Russia by trying to provoke it, really, to spend more resources on defense, right? But then, if you read this report, they consider this idea: what if we try to, for instance, provide more military aid to Ukraine in order to provoke Russia into, trying to do something in Ukraine? So what if we try to do that? And then they completely reject this idea. They say it doesn't make sense because it can lead to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. It can lead to increasing tensions, and we should not do it. So American establishment kind of rejected this idea. And in fact, the amount of military aid provided to Ukraine before the war was very small. It was almost non-existent. So this is important to remember. And the point was not to provoke Russia, you see? So there were really not much kind of malignant intentions on the part of America in Ukraine specifically, right? So they kind of left Ukraine hanging a bit, but they didn't try to provoke Russia with Ukraine. It's a wrong idea. They didn't try to do that. And so currently, of course, they see no problem in Russia continuing to destroy itself with this war. So like America is not going to help Russia. Even though some observers, like some even conservative observers in America, they say, yeah, but we need a strong Russia. So maybe we need to force these peace agreements in order to use a strong Russia as an ally. Even now they say that, some of them, right? But in general, they're not going to help Russia, but they did not provoke this war. So for instance, like the Kremlin says, that America was supplying Ukraine with weapons all the time. But it's just not true. Some of those weapons, even a small number of weapons, they were supplied with the specific idea that Ukraine cannot use them on the battlefield. So it's true. Like it was under Trump's administration, they supplied Ukraine with a bit of Stinger missiles, and they told Ukraine that they should be stored in the western part of the country so that they are never used on the battlefield against Russia. And this is kind of just a precaution. And this is a very small shipment. And so, what kind of provocation is that if they are really, really small shipments of weapons? So just I fundamentally disagree that America was trying to provoke Russia into attacking Ukraine. It's just not true.
Do either of you have any thoughts about what the U.S. Or how? Let me put it this way: what kind of a society the U.S. state would like to mold in Ukraine? As a result of the war.
It's also I think it's a wrong idea to think that America is trying to mold some society in Ukraine. So, in my opinion, it might be possible that some international kind of economic consultants, they are pushing for neoliberal reforms, for instance. This is true. But it's not like America is trying to transform Ukraine into something new. So, and I don't think it's even possible. You can't just transform one country into something new. It's not how it works. So the initiative is on the Ukrainian side, right? So it's true that there is this influence in terms of some neoliberal solutions to Ukraine's economic problems, but I wouldn't go beyond that. I think that Ukraine's fate is ultimately in the fates of Ukrainians and not Americans, not American establishments.
And also, just to add, I don't think Zelensky and his government actually need to be pushed in order to implement neoliberal reforms, but because they were actually doing it before the war, and this is their political program, even if they don't really have a program, but this is how they view the rational economic system. And these are they have this neoliberal thinking, and most of the time they are even more radical in their economic solution than what actually European Union, for example, asked them to do. So this is they are going in the logic of this dismantlement of welfare and social state and all this what is left after the Soviet Union, but it is not the will of some external powers. Of course, we don't. In Ukraine, there is we can talk about it afterwards, but I think it is not some intentions from the US in particular that motivates the post-Soviet oligarchic systems to be what they are. They have their own logic and their own agency in it, and we need to actually understand how this kind of post-Soviet economy functions in itself.
Yeah, so I would add that, interestingly, in the 90s, the same argument was put forward in relation to Russia. So America was pressuring Russia into doing these neoliberal reforms. So shock therapy was supposedly invented in the United States and by these international financial institutions, and they were kind of pressuring Russia into implementing shock therapy. But this is just not true. It was a domestic Russian project, and even the contents of these reforms, they were mostly developed by Russian economists themselves. They were the neoliberals. So Russia just had its own neoliberal economists. And this was ultimately the reason that Russia implemented these reforms. So the IMF was not able to pressure Russia into anything. So Russia is not the country that can be pressured by the IMF. It's just not physically possible. It was a domestic project, and it had kind of a class basis. So there were strong social forces in support of these neoliberal reforms, and this is why they happened. And in Ukraine, I think it's kind of similar, that there is a domestic reason for neoliberalism, and it can be opposed domestically as well. But it's not just America pressuring Ukraine into adopting all these reforms.
Yeah, just to add that for me, it's also one of the expression of this kind of Western-centric, egocentric approach to understanding international politics is to think that United States are behind all wars on the planet Earth and they are pushing all the economies to become neoliberal. Of course, we cannot ignore its hegemonic place in the whole structure. But in order to understand really what is happening, we need to take into account the agency of the actors. And yeah, most of the time in the post-Soviet space, local actors are even more neoliberal and wild capitalists as then we can imagine in the US.
Yeah, like in general, American influence in this conflict is not that strong. So, I mean, apart from supplying weapons, which are of course crucial to continuing the war, like in a wider context, I mean, American influence in the post-Soviet region in general, it's not that strong. I mean, this is ultimately between those post-Soviet countries and Russia. So it's not really about America in many ways.
Thanks. I think that's helpful for listeners to hear. I want to now turn to talk a little bit about the politics of the left in so-called Canada. I think it's also generally true in the US. In understanding the left in a broad sense, the dominant view on the broad left in Canada would be basically tailing behind the politics of Western states, which we could call, if you like, pro-NATO campism, to think about it in those terms. That's certainly true for most people who support the New Democratic Party, which is the party which we could now call a social liberal party. Here, the party that most union and community activists support, even if they're not very enthusiastic about it, because of the way that the electoral system works. Again, I'll just mention Gilbert Ashkar, who, as I should make clear for listeners who don't know, is also very strongly opposed to the anti-NATO campism that we'll talk about later. He's written that this current of people on the left are deliberately ignoring the fact that Ukraine is clearly being used as a proxy by NATO powers in order to cripple their Russian imperialist rival. That's his perspective. Of course, he's very clear that this is a war of aggression by Russia, and that the war remains predominantly an anti-imperialist war of self-defense. But I wonder if you have any thoughts to people on the left here who would ignore the agenda of the NATO powers in relation to Ukraine. I guess that would be a way of putting the question. Any thoughts about that?
Well, I think first we need to clarify, to be clear, what do we talk about, NATO or NATO member countries? Because NATO is not acting as a bloc in this war, as far as I can understand. That member countries have very different level of engagement and have quite different position. Take Turkey, for example, or Greece or Hungary, compare it with France or Germany or Italy, etc. So beside that, there are also countries who are not NATO members, but who support the military effort of Ukraine. So I think we need to make clear what do we talk about NATO as an actor, about NATO countries. If it's NATO countries, we need to take each country individually. And does some NATO countries pursue their own selfish interests in this war? Of course they do. Like, it would be strange if it wasn't so. There is no state in the world that would support other state out of, moral compassion. This is not how it works. But I don't agree with this point about proxy war, because if Ukraine was a NATO proxy or some particular country's proxy used to cripple Russia, it would not need to cry out for weapons for 2 years already. And as for today, the nature and the scale of this assistance, military assistance, is completely insufficient to sustain Ukrainian efforts to retake their land. And now we're seeing it in practice, how the Ukrainian counteroffensive is actually cannot be so much successful because of the shortage of the weapons. And NATO countries are giving Ukraine only enough weapons to hold the line. And some of them, particularly European one, they are visibly hoping for kind of a negotiated peace, maybe with Russia. They are hoping for the return of some kind of status quo, where they would continue, their business as usual, buy cheap hydrocarbons from Russia to continue to sustain what they seem to be an unlimited economic growth in Europe. And if we want to, to denounce this kind of hypocrisy of NATO member countries, how NATO powers are using Ukraine, I think we must talk primarily about this, about the way somehow they want to make a deal with so-called great powers like Russia above the heads of subalterns, above the heads of Ukrainians, like they always did, actually. So in the context of this Russian aggression in Ukraine, I think to focus yourself on these proxy war theories, or to even to focus yourself on these anti-NATO calls, for example, exclusively, for me, is, to say it mildly, it is kind of politically irresponsible. But what we can do instead is we can, for example, to fight for the universality of norms, the universality of sanctions when these norms are violated. We can fight for, democratizing, for example, the United Nations, for creating another, or inside of the United Nations, to create a collective, democratically run infrastructure that could address these important international security issues, the issues of ecology. Also, we need really to collaborate on this question, and this collaboration seems to be more and more impossible to actually solve the problem of ecological crisis because of the war, and because how the war logic infects our societies. So we, instead of just this schematic thinking, we could focus on how this international legal and security order can be protected, considering the fact that some other countries than Russia, US among others, have undermined this international order multiple times. And this means that we must insist that the criminals of all wars must be punished, must be brought to justice. So we can actually make a lot of connections and have a more nuanced thinking about what is going on, instead of saying just we're against NATO and against Russia. Okay, but what do you propose actually?
Right. So I will talk about it from a slightly different perspective. So, for instance, this idea that America wants to cripple Russia with this war. So you can look at it in a different way. First of all, Russia has the biggest nuclear arsenal in the world. So it's slightly bigger than even American one. And it's very clear that American authorities consider this to be a very serious threat. And this is part of the reason why American response was very measured. And these supplies of weapons, they are always, they try not to escalate too much, not to provoke Russia too much, not to risk nuclear war. So like American authorities consider nuclear weapons to be a real threat. So why would they want an alliance between China, that they also antagonize, and Russia, that has the world's biggest nuclear arsenal? So this tighter alliance between China and Russia becomes a real problem for America, because it's Chinese economic strength plus Russian nuclear arsenal. So in terms of geopolitics, I mean, from the American point of view, it doesn't make much sense to antagonize Russia too much in order to throw it into the arms of China, right? So that you have this new Cold War between two blocks, essentially, Russia and China on the one hand, and the West on the other hand. So, and actually a lot of kind of realists in America, they say, look, we spend too much money, we spend too much weapons on this war, but we have to spend all these resources on China instead. This is really the arguments that a lot of Americans make, a lot of these American security establishment types. So in that sense, what is ultimately important to understand, that it was Russian agency that created this war. It's all on Russia. It is on the Kremlin. So America did not provoke it, and I don't think that they wanted it. So, like, in my opinion, this is wrong to think that America ever wanted this war, even like deep down or something. No, they just didn't want it. Maybe like their approach could be different, but they did not want this war, and I think that they actively tried to prevent it. And in fact, if we look at the events before the war, like 2-3 months before the war, so Putin was trying to blackmail America into some kind of diplomatic negotiation, and this actually worked. So actually, Americans were beginning to offer some real concessions to Russia on the diplomatic front in order to prevent the war. So these concessions were nothing like what Putin wanted, but they were real steps, by America to try to reconcile positions. But all these steps were ignored by the Kremlin because at this point, Putin already decided that he wants to start a war. So, I just don't think that this is some kind of premeditated strategy by America to weaken Russia through this war. So it's not clear that Russia is militarily, for instance, that it is weakened, because Russian military-industrial complex is now working basically non-stop, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. All these factories are full with orders to rebuild Russian military very quickly. So Russian military production is expanding all the time, and Russia is weaker economically, but it might be actually become stronger militarily than before. It is possible. So, and then it joins China in this alliance, and it becomes a real problem. So I don't think that it was in NATO's interest to do that. So, yeah.
So, just kind of picking up on some of this, unfortunately, we're in a situation here where there are, many people on the left who rightly reject Western imperialism, but then sympathize with Russia with this kind of enemy of my enemy is my friend logic, or they're at least influenced both by those ideas of what we could call anti-NATO campism. And I think you've effectively already demolished the idea that the US is primarily responsible for the invasion, which is this idea that we sometimes hear, that the idea that the Russians were provoked into it or something like that. But another argument that we sadly run into on the left here is that the idea that the Ukrainian government is a far-right nationalist government, and we can trace the origins of this back to the 2014 Maidan uprising, which was a right-wing coup. So again, for people who don't know anything about 21st century Ukrainian history, here, could you briefly just respond to some of those claims which get a lot of circulation on the left in the West?
Before answering this, I would maybe just add a few more things to finish about this NATO and anti-NATO thing. I don't know if Ilya agrees with me, but as far as I know, Putin was not always anti-West and anti-NATO. Russia was even in partnership with NATO and even organized some common military trainings back in the beginning of 2000. And it is mostly in 2011 that Putin started to say that Russia is under danger, under the threat of NATO, Western enemies, that nation must support him because only him can protect Russia from this danger. And so we can ask ourselves what actually happened in 2011. Was it a year when some Western country was particularly aggressive towards Russia or something like that? Well, it seems to me it was not the case. And the only thing that really happened this year in Russia, it was that ordinary Russians took to the streets to denounce the fact that Putin violated constitution. He wanted to be elected for the third time. They also protested against corruption, police violence, inequality, etc. And we also must remember that Putin sent its army to crush in blood some popular revolutions in Belarus, in Kazakhstan, when there was no question about Western influence, NATO whatsoever in these countries. People there were protesting against dictatorship in one case, against economic inequality in the second case. So visibly, it's not NATO that really threatens Russian elite, and it's mostly the desire of people in post-Soviet countries to no longer live in the corrupt mafia state. So in my opinion, just to close this topic, that Putin's action on the international stage have more to do with Russian internal politics than with this presumed dangers emanating from the outside. So the threat is not external, it is mostly internal, and it is not objective threat to Russian population, but a threat to Russian regime, the regime that actually clings to power. And this is very important to not assimilate the two. If you talk, Russia is threatened, you assimilate the interest of the population and the interest of the political elites. And I don't think that Russians actually agree when we do that. So just to finish on this point, and about the Ukrainian government being a far-right nationalist regime, I don't know where to start. I mean, I think only a person that has chosen actually to make abstraction of reality can still repeat this kind of things over and over again. So, what I say, in 2014, Maidan uprising was a popular uprising against, provoked by the fact that President Yanukovych rejected the possibility to sign the economic agreement with the European Union under pressure of Russia, and turned his decision to ally economically with Russia. And so this provoked this manifestation, but when they became really massive is after the police violence. So what sparked really the massive protest when millions of people came to the streets, it was the extreme police violence of the Ukrainian state, which was kind of not familiar to Ukrainians, because before that, even the semi-authoritarian President Leonid Kuchma didn't dare to do such things. As all the popular movements and all the popular uprising against the authoritarian state, all the fractions of society participate in it. All people of the whole political spectrum, from the extreme left to the extreme right, but most of the people, like 99% of them in Ukraine that were participating in this movement, were not politicized, were not supporting any particular political movement. But why we see extreme right militants, activists on the forefront of this protest is that they were the force that was actually already used to use physical violence, already has a militarized culture. So they were the ones who were ready to fight against the police. It was not just the extreme right, but the extreme right was particularly present on the Maidan, but it doesn't make the whole protest being an extreme right and a far right protest. And also, just one element to understand is that 5 years after the war in 2019, the far-right parties that formed an electoral coalition got only 2% in parliamentary elections in Ukraine, so they didn't even get into parliament. I don't know if I need to remind you how many percent far-right candidates win in certain Western countries. So the far-right in Ukraine certainly exists, and they have a certain presence in society. And the far-right violence on the street was an issue, particularly for some of the left-wing activists in Ukraine. But the far-right do not have, and they haven't been able to establish themselves as a legitimate political subjects. However, the risk of the threatening of the far-right, in fact, could be real if Zelensky capitulate or make too many compromises with the invading force. Think about the example of Ireland, how the things were going there. So the massive resistance would continue in a different form. For example, in a form of guerrilla led by these hardline nationalist forces. So this is one of the risks if Zelensky appears to not be strong enough to actually protect the country. So the Ukrainian society may be transformed into a more nationalist and more far right. The far right may just gain more of presence in the society, and may actually maybe come to power. But for the moment, I don't think this is a real threat for now.
There's another idea, which it's unfortunate to even have to raise it, because I think it's probably, well, maybe the most absurd thing that we hear from some people on the so-called left here. And you've partially responded to it already, but I'll just throw the claim out, and you can respond to it as you wish. And that's the idea that the war is both a proxy war by Western imperialism trying to weaken and destabilize Russia, but seeing the objective is to go actually promote regime change and to carve up Russia into several weaker, smaller countries. And on that basis, the West wants to prolong and escalate the war. Could you respond maybe briefly to that claim?
So I would say the following. It's true that some sections of like American national security establishment now considers this idea. I'm not sure how they can actively realize this goal. So what they need to do to realize it. But it's true that now some like parts of American establishment, they consider this idea that maybe it would be great if Russia just disintegrated. But then again, I don't see who is to blame for this other than Putin himself. So he just created the situation where even this kind of discussion is possible. So before the war, this was completely meaningless. And now this is discussed seriously because we see that all kinds of contradictions in Russia are sharpened. And for instance, like we saw Prigozhin's revolt. So what if Kadyrov is next and his troops? So what's going to happen next? Yeah, I think that in America, some people like entertain this idea. But ultimately, again, it's not about them. It's about Russia's internal processes. And it was Putin who created this real danger that Russia could not disintegrate, but there could be some kind of civil war. In my opinion, like Putin's previous record in government, that the way he governed the country by creating these semi-feudal kind of positions and creating this very powerful men who now even control their own kind of armies, like Prigozhin, right? So, and the way he shaped his relationship with Chechnya and with Kadyrov, and also the war itself, all this led to the possibility of some kind of huge internal conflict in Russia. But again, this is not about America. So yes, it's true that in America, some people entertain this idea that maybe it would be beneficial for the United States if Russia disintegrated. Most other people, even like hawkish national security types, they still reject this idea. They say, no, this is just, I mean, this is crazy. Nuclear weapons will fall into the hands of some, I don't know, warlords or something. And furthermore, we still need Russia, you know, to as a bulwark, maybe even against China. So it's a minority opinion in America. But much more important fact is that Putin's actions created, you know, the very reality in which we can discuss this. So like before, we couldn't discuss it. But now, I mean, so after Prigozhin, everything is possible. And some kind of huge conflict in Russia, even a civil war. I think, unfortunately, it is possible. And this is very scary to me, but I have to just admit it, just based on reality, based on what we see happening in Russia.
Thank you. So in the time we have left, I'd like to ask some questions that I think would be helpful for listeners, because not many people here have a very accurate sense of what the situation is like in Ukraine today or in Russia today. So I'm wondering, Hanna, if you could share some thoughts about what you think listeners here most need to understand. Like what are the most important things people need to understand about how Ukrainian society has changed since the war began?
Well, it will be difficult to say what is the most important, of course. War changed everything. It's primarily, of course, the war destroyed the lives of many Ukrainians. It also destroyed the economical potential of Ukraine. The Russian army also did a lot to damage the ecosystems, which has irreversible consequences, especially in the eastern and southern part of Ukraine, eastern part being a highly industrialized region, and the amount of ecocide and the amount of damage done to the nature and also to the human infrastructure in this region, which was the most populated region of Ukraine before, it's even hard to imagine. So we will deal with all these consequences. The Ukrainian society must deal with it, and nobody knows how exactly. So also the thing that is important to understand is that Russia is actually using a strategy of terror against the civilian population. It's bombing mostly residential areas. So a lot of Ukrainians, like all the Ukrainians, actually live under the constant threat of missiles that can reach any part of the country anytime. We have also thousands, tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of civilians who have found themselves under the occupation, who were victims of forced displacement, of rape, of torture on a mass scale, also of murder. So we have basically a population of 40 million people who will live with PTSD for the rest of their lives, and children included, and we will have to deal with it somehow. So, but despite also the horrors of this war, what we have seen, what we have experienced as a society is the capacity of ordinary citizens, ordinary Ukrainians for self-organization, and it remains actually one of the keys for the country's to the country's resistance to this imperialistic aggression. So people are extremely engaged into resistance, organizing themselves from below, and they're doing it to support the military effort on one side, but also on the other side, an important fraction of society tries to organize itself to oppose the antisocial policies of this very same state they are actually supporting when it comes to the military effort. It doesn't mean that Ukrainians are became completely passive towards the misdeeds of its own government.
Thank you. Could you say something briefly about how you think the politics of nationalism have changed during the course of the war within Ukraine?
This is also a huge topic, of course. First thing that we need to understand how the Ukrainian nationalism changed is we need to consider that the war in Ukraine didn't start in 2022. It started and was infecting the whole social life since 2014. So even if the scale was not the same, this is since 2014 that people have friends and relatives dying on the front line. So the state and society are actually at war for 9 years already. So of course, there is this kind of the emotional affiliation with the state that defends itself against the external aggression. Of course, it becomes more prominent among the population. And in the struggle against the aggression, people adopt more and expose more national symbols. They think of themselves more in national terms, which was not the case before 2014. And of course, they start to value the things that actually can be taken for granted in the countries that have gained their independence centuries or decades earlier, like things like political sovereignty, cultural sovereignty. This is something we are taking for granted, but for Ukrainians, this is something they are fighting for at this very moment. And in that sense, we can say that, yes, the Ukrainian nationalism became stronger. It became mainstream after the Russian invasion of 2014. And of course, after the full-scale invasion, the tendency continued. But after the 9 years of war, of course, we may expect that Ukrainian society will become ethno-nationalist, but the reality, however, is more complex because if we see the president of Ukraine that was elected in 2019, we basically had two candidates. One candidate was a former president, Poroshenko, who had a kind of ethno-nationalist agenda, and his rival was Zelensky, Russian-speaking, of Jewish origin, and also he, in his political campaign, he emphasized the unity of different regions of Ukraine. He was explicitly countering this ethno-nationalist discourse, and he won the elections in all the regions of Ukraine except the far western Lviv. He won the elections with 73% of the vote. And also he was elected on the promise of finding a so-called diplomatic solution to the war in the Donbass. He promised to negotiate with Putin, which he actually tried to do back in 2019. In one way, we can say that Ukrainian nationalism has become mainstream. Is it ethno-nationalism? I'm not sure. It's a nationalism in making. It can take any form, and I think the agency of the Ukrainian society and also of its progressive left components can influence the way how the Ukrainian society will define itself. Will it be some essentialist ethno-nationalist discourse or civic nationalism? But we cannot avoid the nationalist sentiment in the context of war, in my opinion.
Thank you. Ilya, I'd like to ask you the same question. Obviously, this could be a whole topic by itself, but what do you think listeners most need to understand about how Russian society has changed since the start of the war?
So, first of all, I would say that Ukraine's devastation is not comparable to Russia's devastation as a result of this war, but still this criminal stupidity of Putin's actions led to huge losses for the Russian society as well. Economic losses and the loss of this perspective for the future. So what's going to happen to Russia in the future? It's not clear. So it's going to be downhill from there, probably. And in terms of Russian society, so the scary thing here is that, in my opinion, we can now say that Russia is slowly transforming into a fascist country. So previously, I wouldn't agree with that. So Putin's regime was based on a very passive population, and it was okay with people not believing in any ideology as long as they don't interfere with the Kremlin. It's okay that people are not ideologically indoctrinated. They're very passive. They don't want to do anything in support of the regime. But now I see that these extreme conservative, reactionary ideologies are penetrating the school education, for instance. And really, the children are just taught this nationalist bullshit on a massive scale. And this is slowly transforming into a fascist state in which the population is actively, so the authorities are trying to engage the population actively with these kinds of policies. So they really want to indoctrinate the people in their ideology. And this can lead to a situation in which really the society changes for the worse. So it becomes basically like a fascist society in which people actively want to achieve these genocidal goals, like in Nazi Germany. So I wouldn't say that this already happened, but there is a tendency. There is a tendency towards fascization, right? And on the other hand, there are some like pockets of resistance in Russia, but the nature of repression is such that any kind of legal resistance is no longer possible. So everything is criminalized, and the Russian state is actually very effective in punishing its opponents. So now they're basically grabbing everyone who disagrees. So Boris Kagarlitsky is the most recent example. So it's not just Boris, this world famous leftist intellectual. It's actually the whole media that he created, Rapcore. So now all of these people are treated as some kind of terrorist organization, in fact, right? So they just proves that repression is really kind of unlimited. But it's not just about repression. Like I said, it's also about these attempts to actively engage the people in their kind of reactionary ideology and indoctrinate the youth, indoctrinate children, and they do it through schools, they do it through universities. And if this goes on for several years, we really, just Russian society will be unrecognizable. So I now obviously live outside Russia because it's not possible to talk in this way while you remain in the country. And I'm afraid that in several years, I will just not recognize Russia. It will be just a different country and an extremely scary one and dangerous to the whole world. Because once you start this process, this can gain its own momentum. So this can become like a tendency that sustains itself, that just like the society becomes more and more fascist because of these policies. So like I said, this is not a complete process, but there is a very strong tendency towards it. So like they adopted a new history textbook recently, for instance, in which there's a chapter about so-called special military operation. And basically this official version of this war will be pushed to children starting at a very early age. And the ideological kind of work will be very strong. And in my opinion, since there are still these pockets of resistance and people who think differently, I think from the outside, it's important not to lump every Russian together, because it's just objectively not true that everyone thinks the same, you know, and to continue this idea that literally all Russians are exactly the same, this is very counterproductive in terms of this fascization process, because it just aids it, because more and more people in Russia, then they'll believe, yes, so there is no alternative, and we should rally behind Putin, we should rally behind the Kremlin, and this will only help this tendency.
Finally, obviously the situation is quite different, but terribly grim in both countries, obviously not the same. But what can people on the left who are listening to this podcast do to help socialists in Ukraine and Russia today?
Well, I would like to say a few words about the left in Ukraine now. A thing that we need to know is that regardless of political disagreements, the society in Ukraine is now kind of united by this need actually to protect its independence and to survive as a society. And we tend to forget, but it's a necessary condition for any political life. So there is this kind of unity of a Ukrainian society and the state. But in this situation, the Ukrainian authorities, instead of concentrating their efforts on, for example, adapting the countries to the needs of resistance, adapting the economy, they launched a liberalization program. They're undertaking anti-social reforms. So they are trying to actually dismantle the welfare. So Ukrainians, of course, they are ready to endure the difficulties that are posed by the Russian invasion, but most of them find it extremely unfair that their government put this burden of war on the poorest part of the population. And so there is still independent unions and left organizations in Ukraine who are very active. Socialny Ruch, my organization, social movement, is also now active in Ukraine. And our position is the following one, and we try to actually communicate this position to the international audience. So we ask to increase military, financial, diplomatic support for the Ukrainian state. But we want that this war is not used to favor the corporations, to favor the Ukrainian oligarchs at the expense of the people. And this is the reason why we need left allies who are actually ready to act in the support of Ukrainians instead of continuing to write endless pro or anti-NATO manifestos. So, as I said, so left support is crucial. So the Ukrainian progressive forces could become stronger and could help Ukraine to become truly independent, to become democratic, pluralistic, inclusive, social-oriented society. And for the leftist abroad, for the leftist in the US or in other countries, of course, I think being in solidarity with Ukrainians, being in solidarity with people in struggle means more possibilities actually to defend justice for all of us. Because if we allow fascism and dictatorship to win somewhere, it means that it will open a way for fascism everywhere. So, and I think this is a huge issue for all of us, how to build this dialogue, how to build this active solidarity among the oppressed, how to not to think like a state, but to think like a worker, like someone who wants to help a person like you on the other part, in the other part of the world. So you can help, of course, Ukrainian left by amplifying their voices. You can build the links with the forces of social transformation, for example, Ukrainian civic organization, trade unions, but also with Belarusian and Russian progressive anti-war organizations, with anti-colonial activists, with feminists. You can raise money for their initiatives. You can participate also in the international campaigns. For example, there is a campaign for the cancellation of the Ukrainians' foreign debt, a campaign in support of Russian anti-war activists imprisoned by Putin, etc., etc. So, and also you can incite the Western governments to confiscate the assets of Putin's oligarchs and to use them for the reconstruction of Ukraine. And yeah, just to finish, I think in order to help Ukraine, we need in general to oppose and to be critical also, and to debate with those, to try to persuade those people who tend to welcome the rise of non-Western imperialisms just because they present themselves as a kind of a multipolar challenge to American domination. Unfortunately, the multipolar world promoted by people like Putin, like Modi, like Xi, like Bolsonaro or Trump, it will be a wonderful place for dictators, for the far right, but it will be a hell for all of us, for ethnic minorities, for workers, for women, LGBT people, etc. So I think in order to help Ukrainians and also Russian socialists, for example, Russian progressivists, you need to simply stay in solidarity with the oppressed against the oppressor. But most importantly, you have not to confuse the two.
So in terms of organized efforts, there is a group called Ukrainian Solidarity Network that is active in the United States and unites many leftist groups and leftist activists. And it organizes various events across the country. And so one thing to do is to engage with this group and to engage with its efforts. From the Russian side, I would add that maybe just a really important thing for Western left-wing activists to do is education, just to learn more about the region, to learn more about Ukraine, to learn more about Russia, about Russian imperialism, in order to have a better perspective. I think this is not a difficult thing, but it's just really important just to have a better understanding of what's going on. And furthermore, of course, there are anti-war Russian initiatives, including left-wing or left-leaning initiatives that need support, that they need help. For instance, feminist anti-war resistance. So actually a very large group that unites a lot of people. Media like Posle, this website that we launched with several comrades in order to kind of create an anti-war platform for the Russian left. So different projects that need support. In terms of concrete efforts, I would emphasize that.
And listeners will be able to find links to some of these projects that have been mentioned in the show notes for this episode. So Hanna, Ilya, thank you so much for taking the time to have this conversation.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure.
That's it for this episode of Victor's Children. I'd like to thank Jonathan Croker, the producer of Victor's Children, without whom the podcast wouldn't be possible. I'd also like to thank Posle, who designed the graphic for Victor's Children. If you found the episode worth listening to, please do tell other people about the show, since word-of-mouth recommendations are especially helpful. If you don't subscribe through your preferred podcast app, please do. And while you're there, please give the show a high rating. It helps to promote us. If you have a suggestion for an episode or some other kind of constructive feedback, feel free to be in touch with me. You can contact me through victorschildren@gmail.com.